She doesn't cry. Don't beg. Don't say a word. In front of her husband's pregnant mistress, in front of her cruel mother-in-law, in front of a divorce courtroom full of eyes waiting for her to collapse, Vivian Ashcroft just took a pen, signed her name, and stood up. Then she walked out and climbed into the jade-green Aston Martin that the whole underworld recognized. Lucien Moretti, the most powerful don of the Moretti Mafia, stood and watched. For the first time in his life, he understood that he had just made the biggest irreversible mistake. If you're watching this story, please like and comment with your city name below. I want to know how far this story goes. The courthouse smelled like floor wax and old paper, and the particular kind of tension that only showed up when powerful men expected to win. Vivian Ashcroft had been inside the Delancey County Courthouse twice before in her life. Once when she was 19 and her father signed over partial interest in 3 offshore accounts to a man who turned out to be a federal informant, and once when she was 26 and stood beside Lucien Moretti while he promised in front of a judge that he would honor and protect her. Both times the building had lied to her. She didn't expect today to be any different. She wore charcoal gray, no jewelry except the small platinum watch her mother had left her, the one with the hairline crack across the face that she'd never bothered to repair because she'd always thought the crack was the most honest thing about it. Her attorney, a compact woman named Dara Fine, who charged $400 an hour and spoke in the clipped cadence of someone who had stopped being impressed by anyone a long time ago, sat to her left and said nothing. That was fine. Vivian didn't need anyone to speak for her today. Lucien came in 7 minutes late. That was theater. He'd always understood the value of making a room wait. He was 51 years old, broad-shouldered, still carrying the kind of physical confidence that men in his position either earned or borrowed from the violence they commanded. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than some people's cars. His hair was silver at the temples now, which the gossip in certain circles said made him look distinguished. Vivian thought it just made him look older than he'd expected to get. Selena Voss walked in behind him. That was also theater, though a crueler kind. She was 29, visibly pregnant, dark-haired, and wore the expression of a woman who had been coached on how to hold her face in public. Vivian had never hated her. That had confused people, including Selena herself. But Vivian had spent enough time inside the Moretti world to understand that women like Selena weren't the architects of anything. They were recruited, flattered, installed. The blame was calibrated elsewhere. Lucien's mother, Constance Moretti, sat in the gallery behind the defense table. She was 73 years old, wore black as though she were attending a funeral she was personally pleased about, and kept her eyes fixed on Vivian with the particular intensity of a woman who had spent half a century watching other women flinch. Vivian did not look at her. The proceedings were efficient. They had already negotiated the financial settlement through counsel. Lucien had assumed correctly that Vivian would want nothing from him. What he hadn't understood was why. He'd taken her absence of demands as weakness, as grief dressed up in pride. His attorney had actually smiled when the terms came through. Dara Fine had not smiled back. When the papers were placed in front of Vivian, she read every line. Not because she needed to, she'd read them 4 times already, but because she refused to perform urgency for anyone in that room. She could feel Lucien watching her. She could feel Constance watching her. She could feel Selena's eyes cutting sideways with the nervous energy of a woman unsure of whether she was supposed to feel triumphant or afraid. Vivian picked up the pen. She signed her name in full. Vivian Helena Ashcroft, maiden name restored by her own request 3 weeks ago, and set the pen down with the quiet precision of someone who had just finished a task they'd been planning for a long time. She did not cry. She had cried already, privately, in the bathroom of her apartment at 4 in the morning 6 weeks ago, and she'd decided that was the last time. Not because grief was shameful, because she was done spending herself on a man who had never understood what he had. The judge said words. Attorneys exchanged papers. Lucien leaned toward his lawyer and said something Vivian couldn't hear, and she didn't try to. Then it was done. She stood up, buttoned her jacket, and walked out. The courthouse steps were broad and pale in the October light. There was a small crowd, some press, some onlookers who'd heard enough whispers to show up hoping for a scene, a few black cars idling at the curb that belonged to men Lucien had sent to observe. Vivienne descended the steps at a measured pace and walked to the far end of the parking structure where she'd left it. The Aston Martin was the green of deep water, a color that shifted depending on how the light hit it, and it was 63 years old and worth more than most buildings in this part of the city. Her grandfather had purchased it in London in 1962, driven it to Naples, shipped it to New York, and declared it the one possession no Ashcroft would ever sell. It had sat in climate-controlled storage for 11 years while she was married to Lucien because he'd told her once, early on, that driving it made her look like she was trying to prove something. She had believed him, or she had wanted to believe that accommodating him was the same as choosing peace. She unlocked it, got in, and pulled out of the parking structure onto the street. She didn't see Lucien's face as she passed the courthouse entrance, but the men in the black cars saw the car, and within 4 hours so did every family in the syndicate. The Ashcroft name had been quiet for years. Lucien had counted on that silence. He'd assumed it was permanent. He was wrong about a lot of things. The Moretti compound outside the city was a property that officially belonged to a real estate holding company registered in Delaware. The main house was Georgian, large without being grotesque, and had the immaculate quality of a place where the landscaping was done by people who understood that perfection was a form of intimidation. Lucien had brought Vivienne there for the first time 18 years ago, when he was still courting her, and she was still young enough to think that power, when you stood close enough to it, felt like warmth. He arrived back from the courthouse in a black Escalade, flanked by two of his capos, Marco Testa, who'd been with the Moretti family for 20 years, and had the build of a man who'd once competed in strongman competitions and hadn't fully retired from that identity, and a younger man named Reardon Cole who'd been brought up through the organization's financial side and spoke rarely but listened with the thoroughness of a recording device. Constance Moretti was already inside when Lucien walked in. She'd taken the position at the head of the dining room table that she always occupied when she intended to conduct something rather than merely attend it. A glass of water sat in front of her, untouched. Her hands were folded. "The car," she said, before Lucien had taken off his jacket. "I saw it." "Everyone saw it. That's the point." She let a beat pass. "I told you years ago that the Ashcroft girl was not what you thought she was." "Ma." His voice had the particular flatness of a man trying to prevent an argument by draining the air from it before it could start. "I'm not scolding you. I'm establishing a timeline for when this conversation becomes necessary." Constance unfolded her hands. "The Castellano family is already called. So has someone from the Ferrante side. They want to understand what the Aston Martin means. It means she's dramatic. Lucien. She said his name the way you'd say, stop. It means she was never yours. And you put the syndicate's credibility behind a marriage to a woman who had her own empire the entire time. Do you understand what that looks like from the outside?" He understood. He understood better than he wanted to admit, and that understanding sat in his chest like something swallowed wrong. He'd built his reputation on knowing his terrain, on never being surprised, and Vivienne had just driven a 63-year-old car past his men and reminded every family in the syndicate that she had never needed him. "Where's Selina?" he said. "Resting." There was something careful in Constance's voice when she said it. "I need to speak with you about her situation before we address the council." "The council isn't a problem." "The council is exactly the problem." She stood up, smoothed the front of her dress, and looked at him with the eyes of a woman who had buried 2 husbands and outlasted 4 dawns, and understood mortality the way most people understood weather, as a constant manageable, something you prepared for rather than feared. "Reardon pulled the quarterly ledgers last week on my request. Not yours. The room changed, not physically, but something shifted in the temperature of it, the way a room changes when someone reveals they've been holding a card they didn't need to show yet." "Why did you have him pull the ledgers?" Lucien said. "Because I wanted to see them before anyone else did." She met his gaze. "You've been moving money, Lucien. Not enough to be obvious. Enough to be a pattern." Selina Voss was 29 years old and had been told, at various points in her life, that she was lucky. Lucky to be beautiful. Lucky to catch Lucien Moretti's attention, Lucky that he'd set her up in a penthouse apartment overlooking the river and filled a nursery with furniture that cost more than most people's annual income. She had accepted these characterizations of her luck for a long time, because accepting them was easier than examining them. Now she sat in the guest suite of the Moretti compound with her feet up on a velvet ottoman and a plate of food beside her that she hadn't touched, and thought about the document that Constance Moretti's attorney had delivered to her 2 days ago. It was 14 pages long, and it used the language of protection and legacy and family continuity to describe an arrangement that, when Selina had read it slowly enough to understand it, amounted to this: sign, and the Moretti family would provide for her and the child financially. In exchange, the child would be raised under Moretti guidance, education, and authority. Decisions about schooling, residency, travel, associations, all subject to family approval. Selina's role would be defined as maternal, supplementary. She'd asked Lucien about it that evening. He told her it was standard. He told her it was for the baby's protection. He'd kissed her temple and asked if she was eating enough and left the room. She hadn't signed. She also hadn't told anyone she hadn't signed. What she had done 3 days ago was make a call from a burner phone she'd purchased in cash from a drugstore 6 miles from the compound. She'd dialed a number that had been left in her car. Tucked under the visor, a card with nothing on it but 10 digits written in ink so precise it might have been typeset. The woman who answered had identified herself only as a contact. She'd spoken in the measured cadence of someone accustomed to conversations that required discretion. She'd told Selina that there was a family attorney in the city, not Moretti, not affiliated, clean, who handled situations like hers. She'd said the word situations the way a doctor says it, when they mean something specific but want to give you room to breathe before they name it. She'd said if Selina wanted a consultation, there was a way to arrange it without anyone knowing. Selina had written nothing down. She'd committed the address to memory the way she'd learned to commit things to memory as a girl, when forgetting something her mother told her had consequences. She didn't know yet who had put the card in her car. She suspected, in the quiet of the guest suite, with the untouched food and the folded contract and the particular quality of silence that came from being in a house full of people who were all deciding things about her future, she suspected she knew the handwriting. Vivienne's apartment was on the 14th floor of a building in the West 50s, a place she'd leased 6 months ago without telling anyone, paying the first year in advance from an account Lucien didn't know existed, not because she'd been hiding it, because he'd never asked about her finances and she'd stopped offering information to people who weren't interested in it. The apartment was not large. She'd chosen it for that reason. The Moretti estate had been enormous and decorated by someone whose philosophy of beauty was indistinguishable from their philosophy of intimidation. And after years of living inside that scale, she'd wanted something she could walk across in 30 seconds. The furniture was good. She had her mother's eye for that. But spare. A couch, a reading chair, a table near the window that she ate at alone and found, to her quiet surprise, that she preferred. She stood at that window now with a glass of water and watched the city and thought about Dara Fine's call, which had come in an hour ago. The Ferrante family's attorney reached out, Dara had said, informally. They want to know if you're available for a conversation. About what? About your grandfather's banking arrangement? Specifically, about certain agreements that were apparently structured through your family's network 18 years ago when you married Lucien Moretti. A pause. Agreements that the Ferrante side is claiming they were not fully informed about at the time. Vivienne had been quiet for a moment. Then she'd said, "Tell them I'm available Thursday." "Do you want to tell me what those agreements actually are?" "Not yet." There was a lot Vivienne hadn't told anyone yet. Not because she was deceitful, because there was a specific kind of knowledge that only remained useful as long as it stayed contained, and she had learned, not from Lucien, not from anything he'd taught her, but from her own family and its long, cold history, that you released information the way you released pressure, carefully, incrementally, only when the structure around you could absorb it. She had known, when she married Lucien, that the Moretti syndicate was underleveraged and operating at a deficit that his pride prevented him from acknowledging. She had known because her grandfather's people had done a full assessment before her father gave his blessing. The Ashcroft name had not been offered to Lucien Moretti out of sentiment. It had been offered as a structural investment, routed through 3 intermediary entities, sustained by a quarterly transfer that Lucian had categorized in his own ledgers as anonymous external investment. He had never investigated the source. She'd waited all these years to understand if he would. He never had. She set down the glass of water and picked up her phone. There was a text from a number she didn't have saved but recognized, the contact who managed her family's communications. It said, "Council has been notified. Tribunal scheduled for the 22nd. You don't have to attend." She typed back, "I know. I'll attend anyway." She set the phone on the windowsill and looked out at the city and thought about Selena Voss sitting somewhere in the Moretti compound, holding a 14-page document and trying to understand if any of the doors in that house were actually open. Vivian reached for her phone again. She opened a second contact, the attorney she'd hired 8 months ago, the one whose practice operated in the narrow space between the visible world and the one underneath it, the one who specialized in exactly this. "She's ready," Vivian typed. "Make sure the consultation goes through before the 22nd. She sent it. Then she stood at the window for a long time, watching the October dark gather over the city, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not happiness exactly, not relief, but the specific quiet that came when a person stopped waiting for permission to exist on their own terms. Below on the street, she could see the emerald roof of the Aston Martin where she'd parked it, visible from the 14th floor. Visible, she suspected, to a man in a black car across the street who'd been there since 6 o'clock and had tried to be subtle about it. Let him watch. Let him report back. Let Lucienne Moretti spend the night trying to calculate what she was building and who she was becoming without him. He'd spent 18 years underestimating the silence of a woman who was simply waiting for the right time to speak. And now the council had been notified, the ledgers were already being examined, and somewhere across the city a young woman named Selena was holding a burner phone and beginning to understand that the hand that had placed that card in her car had not been extended in judgment. It had been extended in solidarity. The 22nd was 12 days away. Vivian Ashcroft turned away from the window, walked to her reading chair, picked up the book she'd been in the middle of for 3 weeks and had never had the quiet to finish, and began to read. Downstairs, the man in the black car was on the phone. And on the other end of that line, in the Georgian house outside the city, Lucienne Moretti was listening. And for the first time in a very long time, he was listening with something that felt uncomfortably close to fear. 12 days before the tribunal, the Moretti compound operated on the particular kind of controlled tension that Lucian had always mistaken for discipline. Men moved through the hallways with the careful economy of people who understood that the wrong posture at the wrong moment could be interpreted as a declaration. Phones were answered on the first ring. Doors were closed softly. The kitchen staff had stopped playing music 3 days ago without being told to. Marco Testa noticed all of it. He'd been noticing things for 20 years, which was why he was still alive, and why Lucienne still kept him close, and why he sat now in the small office off the main hallway at 7 in the morning with a cup of coffee going cold beside him and a printout of the quarterly ledger spread across the desk, and felt, for the first time in a long career of managed risk, genuinely uncertain about the geometry of his loyalty. The numbers were not catastrophic. That was almost the problem. If they'd been catastrophic, there'd be a clear story, a crisis, an emergency, a reason. Instead, they were surgical. Specific amounts moved through specific channels at specific intervals, routed through a holdings entity that Marco had never been asked to review. He wasn't a forensic accountant, but he'd been around long enough to understand the difference between money that moved because of business and money that moved because someone needed it to disappear. He folded the printout, put it in his jacket pocket, and sat for a moment with his hands flat on the desk, looking at nothing. Then he picked up his phone and called Reardon Cole. Reardon answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been awake already. "Yeah. Where are you?" "East Wing, office." "Stay there." Marco walked the hallway with the printout in his pocket, and the particular sensation of a man carrying something he hadn't decided yet whether to use or destroy. He passed 2 of Lucien's personal security, men he'd worked beside for years, and nodded at them with an ease he didn't feel. They nodded back. Nobody said anything. Reardon's office was small and deliberately unremarkable. A desk, a laptop, a single window that looked out onto the side garden where nothing interesting ever happened, which was why Reardon had chosen it. He was 34 years old, lean in the way of someone who forgot to eat when he was focused on something, and he was focused on something now. He didn't look up when Marco came in. "Close the door," Reardon said. Marco closed it. "You've already seen it." "I pulled it 3 weeks ago." Reardon finally looked up. His face was the kind of face that gave nothing away as a default setting, not because he was hiding things, but because he'd trained himself early that neutrality was the safest baseline. "I didn't say anything because I didn't know yet if I was reading it right." "Are you reading it right?" "Yeah." He leaned back in his chair. He's been routing money to a personal account through the Delancey Holdings entity for 14 months. Not a lot at once. Enough over time. He paused. Enough to matter. Marco sat down in the chair across from the desk. The cold coffee was already feeling like a long time ago. "Does anyone else know?" Constance pulled the same report. "I know because she asked me for the access codes 3 weeks ago, and I gave them to her because she's Constance, and I didn't think I had the option of saying no." Reardon's voice was even. "What she did with the report after that, I don't know." "She knows," Marco said. "Yeah." They sat with that for a moment. Outside, somewhere in the garden, a sprinkler system clicked on and began its mechanical rotation, and the sound of it through the window was almost absurdly mundane against the particular weight of the silence inside the room. "The council gets the ledgers on the 19th, Marco said. "That's 3 days before the tribunal. I know the schedule. So if we're sitting on this, we're not sitting on it." Reardon's voice had an edge now, the first one. "I'm telling you what I know. What you do with it is your decision. What I do with it is mine." He looked at Marco steadily. "But I'm not falsifying a ledger review for the council. If they ask me directly, I'm not lying." Marco looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, and stood up. "All right. Marco." Reardon waited until the older man turned back. "The Ashcroft woman. The anonymous external investment that's been on the book since year 1 of the marriage. I traced the intermediary entities." Marco went still. "All 3 of them root back to the same holding structure." Reardon's voice was careful now, precise. "The Ashcroft family's banking network. She's been the primary external financier of the Moretti Syndicate for 18 years. He let that land. "And she did it quietly enough that nobody looked. Nobody questioned where the stabilization capital came from because the capital kept coming and the syndicate kept functioning, and Lucien never asked." The sprinkler went on turning outside. Marco Testa stood in the doorway of a small office and understood, with the slow and complete clarity of a man who had spent his life reading terrain, that the ground had already shifted under all of them. It had shifted years ago. They were only now looking down and noticing they were standing somewhere different. "He's going to say she manipulated the books," Marco said. "He can say whatever he wants." Reardon turned back to his laptop. "The documentation says what it says." Selena's appointment was at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday at an address in Midtown that looked, from the outside, like an unremarkable suite of professional offices, accounting firms, a dental practice, 2 floors of something medical. The attorney's office was on the 6th floor. His name was Gerald Okafor, and he had the kind of reputation that operated entirely through referrals and never through advertisement, which meant the people who found him were the people who needed exactly what he provided. She'd taken a cab. She'd asked the driver to drop her a block early, and she'd walked the rest in the thin November cold with her coat pulled close and her heart moving at a pace that had nothing to do with exertion. She was 6.5 months pregnant, and her back hurt, and she'd slept badly for 3 weeks, and she was terrified in a way she kept trying to reframe as something more manageable, like caution or alertness. Okafor's waiting room had 2 chairs and a table with a plant on it that was actually alive, which she noticed because the plants at the Moretti compound were always fake. His assistant offered her water, and she accepted it and sat with both hands around the glass and tried to get her breathing even. He came out to get her himself. He was 50-ish, unhurried, wore glasses and a dark suit, and had the quality of a man who had heard a great many things in his career and had organized them all into files rather than opinions. He shook her hand. His grip was firm without being demonstrative. They sat down across from each other in his office, and he opened a legal pad and held his pen and looked at her with an attention that didn't feel like surveillance. Take your time, he said. She took a breath. I was given a contract 2 weeks ago by Constance Moretti. She set her bag on her lap and reached inside and pulled out the 14-page document, still folded the way she'd folded it the first time she'd read it. I haven't signed it. He took it. He read it. He took longer than she expected, turning pages with the methodical patience of someone for whom reading was a precision instrument. When he finished, he set it on the desk between them and folded his hands. Do you understand what you'd be signing? He asked. I understand that I'd be giving them the child. Not technically. Legally, it's structured as a guardianship support arrangement. He touched the edge of the document. But your interpretation is functionally accurate. The decision-making clauses in sections 4 through 7 would give the Moretti family veto authority over every significant choice in your child's upbringing. Education, residence, social environment. The financial provisions are genuine. They would provide for you. But the cost is custody in everything but name. She'd known this. Hearing it said plainly by someone with no stake in her answer still hit her somewhere behind the sternum. What are my options? She said. Several. He said it without drama, which she found more steadying than anything reassuring would have been. The first is independent legal representation in establishing a custody and parenting framework before the child is born. Your rights as the biological mother are primary and not contingent on any arrangement with the Moretti family, regardless of what this document implies. He paused. The second is relocation, if that's what you want. There are resources available to you: housing, legal cover, financial support during the transition. Arrangements that already exist and can be activated within 72 hours if you decide that's the direction. Selena looked at him carefully. Who arranged those resources? He met her gaze. Someone who understands your situation and chose to do something about it. That's all I'm authorized to tell you, and I think, if you think about it, you already have a sense of who. She did. She'd had a sense since she found the card in the car. She'd been sitting with it, the strangeness of it. That the woman who had every reason to be her enemy had instead done this. She hadn't been able to make it into a clean feeling. It was complicated and uncomfortable and real. I'm not asking you to decide today, Okafor said. I'm asking you to understand that you have options, real ones, and that whatever you decide, you should decide it because you've chosen it, not because you've been maneuvered into it. She looked down at her hands around the water glass. Her left hand was trembling slightly, which she hadn't noticed until now. She pressed it flat against her knee. Okay, she said. Tell me what I need to know. Kosult. Constance Moretti called her son at noon. He was in the city, at a restaurant that the family had a financial interest in a private room at the back where the acoustics were designed to prevent exactly the kind of conversation she intended to have. We need to talk about the 19th, she said. I know about the ledger review, Ma. Then you know that Reardon will not adjust his findings. A pause. Reardon works for this family. Reardon works for the syndicate, she said. Those haven't always been the same thing, and they are especially not the same thing right now. She heard him exhale. That particular exhale, the one he'd been making since he was 14, the one that meant he was angry and trying to decide how to wear it. I need to know the exact figure, the amount you moved, because the number that Riordan is going to present to the council in 3 days and the number you have in your head may not be the same number, and I need to know which one is accurate before I walk into that chamber. You don't need to walk into the chamber. I've been walking into chambers since before you could read a ledger. Her voice was controlled but not soft. It had never been soft. Softness was a choice she had made when her children were young and then consciously put away when they became adults who needed something different from her. I've managed 3 crises for this family that you don't even know about because I managed them before they became crises. This one I cannot manage for you because it has your name on it. All I can do is help you understand the shape of what's coming so you don't walk in there surprised. The silence from his end had a texture to it. She'd learned to read his silences decades ago. This one was the silence of a man beginning to assess damage he'd been pretending wasn't there. 412,000, he said finally, over 14 months. She sat with that number. It was not ruinous. But it was not nothing, and more importantly, it was documented, and in the context of a tribunal called to examine his leadership and triggered in part by the collapse of his marriage to an Ashcroft, it would function as confirmation of a pattern. A pattern of taking from the syndicate's resources for personal purposes. A pattern of believing the rules that governed other men did not apply to him. And Selena's contract, Constance said, has she signed it? She'll sign it. Has she signed it, Lucien? Another pause. Shorter, more telling. I'll speak to her tonight. She met with an attorney this morning, Gerald Okafor, Midtown. Constance's voice remained even. Did you know about that appointment? The silence this time was different. She could hear him recalibrating. No. She went alone. Cab, not a family car. Constance looked out the window of her sitting room at the November garden, the hedgerows clipped into their precise shapes, the stone path she'd walked on so many mornings she'd stopped counting. Okafor doesn't take Moretti referrals. He's been used before by women in circumstances adjacent to ours. She paused. He was recommended to Selena by someone with access and motive and a particular interest in making sure she doesn't sign that contract. She let the implication settle. Vivienne, Lucien said. Not a question. I can't prove it yet, but I know the pattern. Constance turned away from the window. Your ex-wife is not regrouping, Lucien. She is operating. And she has been operating with a precision that suggests she has been planning this for considerably longer than since the divorce proceedings. She heard him breathe. She heard the sound of a private dining room, the ambient distance of a man sitting somewhere expensive and feeling the walls shift. She doesn't have the standing to intervene in syndicate matters, he said. She's out. She signed the papers. She signed divorce papers. Constance's voice carried the weight of someone who had lived long enough to understand the difference between legal categories and actual power. She did not sign away the Ashcroft family's financial interest in this syndicate, because you never knew that interest existed, and the council is about to find out that the money that kept this organization solvent for nearly 2 decades came from her family's network. She paused. And that you have been telling them for 18 years that it came from anonymous external investment. The silence from his end had a different quality now, dense, the kind that preceded a man understanding that the thing he'd built his confidence on had a crack in the foundation he'd never bothered to look for. The capos, he started. Some of them already know, or suspect. She sat down in the chair by the window. Marco came to speak with me this morning. He's not moving against you. But he's not going to stand in front of the council and say the ledgers are clean. She folded her hands in her lap. You have 3 days, Lucien. 3 days to decide how you walk into that chamber. Whether you walk in as a man who made mistakes and intends to account for them, or whether you walk in as a man who is going to try to hold a story together that has already come apart. She waited. She'd always been good at waiting. She set this up, he said. His voice had something in it now. Not quite grief, not quite rage, something in between that she recognized as the sound of a person arriving, late, at the truth. From the beginning, the whole... No. Constance's voice was firm. She married you. She supported this family with her own resources for 18 years. She stayed. A pause, and something in her voice shifted. Not softness exactly, but a kind of honesty that she didn't allow herself often. Whatever she's doing now, she's not doing it because she planned it from the beginning. She's doing it because you gave her no choice. There's a difference. And you need to understand that difference before you walk into that chamber. Because if you go in there telling the story of a woman who conspired against you, every Don in that room is going to look at the ledgers and see a man who doesn't understand his own failures. The line was quiet for a long moment. Then Lucien Moretti said, I'll be back at the compound by 4. He disconnected. Constance sat with the phone in her hand and looked at the garden and felt the particular exhaustion of a woman who had spent her life keeping things intact that were not always worth keeping, and who was now watching the seams come apart in real time and was not, if she allowed herself to be fully honest, entirely certain which side of the seam she wanted to be on. She set the phone on the side table. She unfolded her hands and looked at them. The thin skin, the rings she still wore out of habit, the knuckles that ached in the cold now. 73 years old, and she had never once, in all of it, allowed herself the indulgence of being surprised by men. She picked up the phone again. She scrolled to a number she had not called in 11 years. An Ashcroft family contact, not Vivienne directly, but an intermediary she had maintained with the specific and unfocused foresight of a woman who understood that the families you made enemies of today were often the families you needed to reach in 10 years. She typed a single message. I'd like to speak with her before the 19th, privately. No counsel present. She sent it. Then she set the phone face down on the table and went to make herself tea and did not think about whether she had just made a move or whether she had just quietly changed sides. Outside, the sprinkler clicked off. The garden went still. Somewhere on the other side of the city, in a sixth-floor office in Midtown, a young woman with her hands finally steady was reading the first page of documents that would give her a future the Moretti family had never intended. Constance Moretti's message arrived at the Ashcroft intermediary at 2:14 in the afternoon. By 2:31, it had been forwarded to Vivian's phone through a relay that took the shape of an ordinary encrypted messaging app and was anything but. Vivian read it twice, standing in the kitchen of her apartment with a half-eaten lunch on the counter beside her and the November light coming flat through the window. She did not respond immediately. She set the phone face down on the counter and finished eating, standing up, because she'd developed the habit of finishing what she started regardless of what was happening around it. Then she picked up the phone again and typed, "Tomorrow, 11 o'clock. I'll send the location." She sent it and then stood for a moment with her hand still on the phone and thought about Constance Moretti sitting in that Georgian house and making that call, and what it had cost her, if anything, to make it. Constance was not a woman who made moves without architecture behind them. Neither was Vivienne. That was perhaps the only thing they'd ever had in common. She sent a second message to Dara Fine this time. Keep the 19th clear, all of it. Then she went to the window and looked down at the street, and the Aston Martin parked at the curb, and thought about the shape of 3 days. The meeting happened at a restaurant in the Flatiron district that neither woman had chosen for sentimental reasons. It was simply the kind of place where two women of a certain age and presentation could have a private conversation in a corner booth without anyone finding it remarkable. The lighting was low, the tables well-spaced. Vivienne arrived first, which she'd planned, and was already seated with water and a menu she wasn't reading when Constance came through the door at 11:03. The older woman moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who had managed a bad hip for years without acknowledging it. She wore dark wool, no jewelry except plain gold earrings, and her face had the composed blankness of a woman who had decided exactly how much of herself she was going to show before she walked in. She sat down across from Vivian without preamble. A server appeared. They both ordered coffee. When he left, neither of them reached for the menus. "You look well," Constance said. "You didn't come here to tell me that." Constance's mouth moved, not quite a smile, something more evaluating. "No." She folded her hands on the table with the particular stillness of a woman accustomed to occupying rooms. "I came because I want to understand the full shape of what you've done, before the tribunal, before the council hears the ledger review and draws its own conclusions." She paused. "I want to hear it from you." "Which part?" Vivian said. "All of it." Vivian looked at her across the table. She'd sat across from Constance Moretti in various configurations for 18 years. Family dinners, holiday gatherings, the handful of private conversations that happened when two women in the same structure had things to say that couldn't be said in front of the men who thought they were running it. They had never been warm. They had been, at best, mutually respectful in the way of two people who recognized a quality in the other that they couldn't afford to underestimate. The Ashcroft Network has been the primary external financier of the Moretti Syndicate since the second year of my marriage, Vivian said. Her voice was even, factual, like she was reading a report into the record. It was structured through 3 holding entities at my grandfather's direction and my father's approval before the marriage. The intent was to stabilize a syndicate that was underleveraged and protect the organizational relationship between our families. I maintained oversight of the transfers for the duration of the marriage. She paused. When I began the divorce proceedings, I notified the appropriate parties within the Ashcroft network that the arrangement would need to be restructured. Constance was very still. You never told him. He never asked. Vivian picked up her water glass. He received capital. He categorized it. He spent 18 years building an empire on a foundation he didn't understand and didn't investigate because investigating it would have required him to admit the syndicate needed what it was receiving. She set the glass down. I am not responsible for what he chose not to know. The coffee arrived. Neither of them touched it immediately. The council is going to see the ledger review, Constance said. They're going to see the diversion of syndicate funds, and then they are going to see the Ashcroft financing, and they are going to ask why it was never disclosed. Because it was structured to protect the syndicate from internal disclosure, Vivian said. If it had been known, it would have been used as leverage against Lucien, against the family, against the organizational standing. My family chose discretion over recognition. A pause. The council's attorneys will find that every transfer was clean, every entity legitimate, and every arrangement structured in the syndicate's interest. She looked at Constance directly. Whatever Lucien did with the $400,000, that is not in the Ashcroft ledgers. That is in his. Constance picked up her coffee. She drank it slowly, looking at the middle distance, and Vivian watched her and did not rush her. He's going to try to say you manipulated the records, Constance said finally. In the chamber. He'll try to frame the Ashcroft financing as covert control. That you were running the syndicate through him. I know. Can you counter it? The documentation counters it. Vivian paused. But that's not why you're here. You could have gotten this from a financial analyst. She held Constance's gaze. You're here because you want to know if I'm going to go further, after the tribunal, whether I intend to take the syndicate. Constance said nothing, which was its own answer. I don't want it, Vivian said. I never wanted it. I want what I'm building now. That's all. She let a beat pass. But I need the council to see the complete picture, not just the diversion in context, which means the financing, which means 18 years of what was actually sustaining that organization. Not because I want credit, because if they don't see the whole truth, someone will build a false story on top of the partial one. And the people who will get hurt are the soldiers and the families and the people who don't have the standing to protect themselves. Constance looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through the older woman's face, so not softness exactly, but a kind of recognition, the expression of a woman arriving somewhere she'd been moving toward for a while. Selena, Constance said, the attorney. She needed options. That's all I gave her. You gave her Okafor. Someone should have given her Okafor before I did. Vivian's voice didn't carry judgment. It carried the factual weight of a thing that was simply true. She's not your enemy either, Constance. She's a young woman who got close to the wrong man and is now carrying his child and sitting in a house full of people who are deciding her future for her. She paused. She deserves a real choice. The restaurant around them moved in its normal rhythms. The soft collision of cutlery, a table of men near the window laughing at something, a server refilling water glasses with the programmatic cheerfulness of professional hospitality. Constance Moretti sat in the middle of all of it and was absolutely still. What do you want from me? She said. Specifically. Nothing. Vivian said it without hesitation. I don't want anything from you. I came because you asked, and because I think you're trying to understand how to position yourself before the chamber, and I think that's a reasonable thing to want. She picked up her coffee. Whatever you decide to do with what I've told you, that's yours. Constance was quiet for a moment. Then she said, My son is not going to survive this the way he thinks he is. No. He'll fight it in the chamber. He'll try to discredit the ledgers, discredit Riordan, discredit... She stopped. Something in her face tightened, then released. He'll try to discredit you. He can try. He has something. Constance said it carefully, with the carefulness of a woman choosing the weight of each word. I don't know the specifics, but in the last week he's had 2 private meetings with a man I don't recognize. Not a syndicate associate, not family counsel. Someone external. She looked at Vivian steadily. I think he's preparing a counter-narrative for the chamber. I think it involves you specifically. I think it's meant to arrive the morning of the 19th. Vivian held her gaze. She felt something shift in her chest. Not panic, but its cold precursor. The specific sensation of a plan encountering a variable it hadn't accounted for. Do you know who the man is? She said. Not yet. Constance reached for her coat. I'm telling you because whatever I think of how we arrived here, I'm not interested in watching an innocent person get destroyed in a chamber full of men who will believe the worst interpretation of anything they're handed. She stood up. Find out who he is, before the 19th. She left $40 on the table, which was more than the coffee cost, and walked out without looking back. Vivian sat alone in the booth for 4 minutes. She was counting, not consciously, but her mind had always done that when she needed to slow her own reaction down. She drank the rest of her coffee. She breathed. She thought about a man she didn't recognize meeting privately with Lucian in the week before a tribunal, and she thought about what shape a counter-narrative would need to take to do real damage. And she thought about what she had and hadn't disclosed and where the gaps were. Then she picked up her phone and called Dara Fine. I need you to find someone, she said when Dara answered. External contact, met with Lucien twice in the last 7 days, not syndicate affiliated. I need a name before the 18th. That's 1 day. I know, Dara exhaled. I'll make calls. Vivian ended the call. She sat for one more moment. Then she put on her coat and walked out into the November cold and stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the colorless sky and felt the first real unsteadiness she'd felt since she signed the divorce papers. She had planned for a great many things. She had not planned for Lucien to find something to use. Not because she'd been reckless, she'd been meticulous. But meticulous and invulnerable were different things, and she had perhaps, in the certainty of her preparation, confused them. The name came back at 9:47 the following evening. Dara sent it as a single text with no explanation, which meant she'd found it, but didn't want to discuss it on the phone. The name was Thomas Vey. Vivian stared at it. The feeling that moved through her was cold and specific, and arrived with the particular clarity of something that should have been impossible. Thomas Vey was 60 years old, semi-retired, and had spent most of his career as a private forensic investigator specializing in financial reconstruction. She knew this because she had hired him herself, 7 years ago, briefly, for a narrow project involving a disputed account within the Ashcroft network that had ultimately been resolved without litigation. The engagement had lasted 11 weeks. She had paid him through a firm account. The documentation of that engagement was thorough, professional, and entirely legal. It was also in the hands of someone who wanted to build a specific story, something that could be made to look like something else. Not what it was, a routine professional engagement, but something that, framed correctly, in a chamber full of men already primed to look for evidence of manipulation, could be presented as evidence that Vivian Ashcroft had used a forensic investigator to surveil and reconstruct the Moretti Syndicate's internal finances. That she hadn't just been aware of the ledgers, that she had been actively mining them, building a case, preparing. The distinction between truth and the shape of truth was the cruelest thing she knew. She put the phone down. She stood in the kitchen of her apartment in the dark because she hadn't turned the lights on when it got dark and she hadn't noticed, and she stood there and worked through it with the methodical precision of a woman who had learned that the moments when you most wanted to react were the moments when reaction was most dangerous. Vey could be discredited. His engagement by the Ashcroft firm predated any divorce proceedings by 5 years. The timeline alone would contradict the narrative. She had documentation. She had Dara. She had the original contract, the deliverables, the final report, all of it clean. But documentation required time to present, and a chamber is not a courtroom. A chamber is a room full of men with existing suspicions and invested interests, and in that environment, the story that lands first has an advantage that evidence presented afterward has to work twice as hard to overcome. She needed to get ahead of it, not to suppress it. There was no suppressing anything at this point, and she hadn't come this far to become the thing she was fighting against. She needed to present it herself, on her own terms, before Lucien's version arrived. She reached for her phone. She needed to call Dara. She needed to call the Ashcroft intermediary. She needed to reach out to 2 counsel-adjacent attorneys she had relationships with through her family's network and make sure they understood the Vey engagement completely before the morning of the 19th. She was reaching for the phone when it rang. Not Dara's number, not any number she recognized. She answered. Yes. The voice on the other end was male, careful, with the cadence of someone reading from a script they'd memorized too thoroughly. Ms. Ashcroft, my name is Agent Warren Collis. I'm with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Division of the federal government. A pause. I'd like to arrange a conversation at your earliest convenience regarding certain financial structures associated with both the Ashcroft family network and the Moretti Syndicate, structures we've been investigating for the past 14 months. The kitchen was very quiet. Vivian stood in the dark with the phone against her ear and felt the geometry of everything she'd built restructure itself around a new and catastrophic variable. 14 months. The same window in which Lucien had been diverting syndicate funds. The same window in which someone, she did not know yet who, had apparently been feeding information to a federal investigation that was not just about Lucien's diversion, but about the Ashcroft financing itself, about the holding entities, about the transfers she had structured with her grandfather's blessing 18 years ago and maintained with the certainty that they were clean because they were clean. She understood, standing in the dark kitchen with the phone in her hand and the city outside the window making its indifferent noise, that she had been inside someone else's plan this entire time. Not Lucien's. He didn't have the patience or the precision, not Constance's. The older woman's warning had been genuine, she was almost sure of it. Someone who had watched the entire architecture, the divorce, the tribunal, the ledger review, Selena's situation, her own careful construction of the counter-narrative, and had waited for the moment when all the pieces were in motion and the maximum number of people were exposed before making the call that would bring. Vivian did not hang up. That was the first decision, made in the space of a single breath while the city noise outside the window continued its indifference, and Agent Collis waited on the other end of the line with the practiced patience of a man accustomed to the silence that followed his introductions. "What structures specifically?" she said. "I'd prefer to discuss the details in person, Ms. Ashcroft. This isn't the kind of conversation—" "You called me at 10 o'clock at night on an unregistered number." Her voice was even, not hostile, precise. "That tells me either you're operating outside protocol or you want this conversation to happen before I have time to call my attorney. I'd like to understand which one it is before I agree to anything." A pause, longer than she'd expected. "Both," he said. "Partially." She waited. "There's a leak," Collis said, "inside the investigation. We believe documents from our file have already been passed to a third party. If that material reaches the Moretti Tribunal before we've had a chance to establish parameters with you, the nature of the Ashcroft involvement gets characterized in a chamber full of organized crime figures before we have any ability to shape the legal context." He exhaled. "I'm calling you at 10 o'clock because the tribunal is in 36 hours, and because whoever is leaking from my office appears to be doing it on a schedule that aligns with that timeline." Vivian stood very still. "Who engaged your investigation originally?" "I'm not at liberty." "Agent Collis." She said his name the way you said a word you weren't sure was real yet. "Someone gave your office the Ashcroft network structures 14 months ago. Someone with detailed internal knowledge of how those entities were organized. That's not public information. That's not something available from a ledger review." She paused. "Who gave it to you?" The silence this time had a different quality. Uncomfortable. The silence of a man deciding between two versions of his own integrity. "The initial disclosure came through an attorney acting on behalf of an anonymous client," Collis said finally. "We received documentation, thorough, organized, with sourcing that indicated intimate familiarity with both the Ashcroft network and the Moretti Syndicate's operational structure." "When?" 14 months ago. October. October. 14 months ago. The same month Vivian had told Lucien she wanted a divorce. The same month she had, for the first time, consulted Dara Fine. The same month she had begun, carefully and privately, to restructure the Ashcroft network's relationship to the Moretti Syndicate in preparation for what she'd known was coming. Someone had been watching that preparation from the beginning. Someone with access to both sides. Someone who had taken the information she was moving and weaponized it before she'd finished moving it. "I need a name," she said. "The attorney who filed the initial disclosure." "I can't give you that." "Then I need 48 hours before any formal interview. and I need your personal assurance that nothing from your investigation file moves to any external party before I've spoken to my counsel. She paused. If there's a leak in your office, Agent Collis, you need me cooperative more than you need me cornered. 48 hours. Another long pause. 36, he said. That's all I can give you. Fine. She ended the call. She stood in the dark kitchen for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned on the light, picked up her phone, and called Dara Fine. Dara answered on the first ring. It was 10 at night, and she answered on the first ring, which was one of the many reasons Vivian paid her what she paid her. Federal contact, Vivian said. Financial crimes enforcement. Agent named Warren Collis. I need everything you can find on him and on the investigation by 6 tomorrow morning, and I need you to find out who filed the initial disclosure 14 months ago. Anonymous client, attorney intermediary. She paused. Someone who had access to the Ashcroft network structures and the Moretti internal operations simultaneously. Dara was quiet for 2 seconds. That's a short list. I know. I'll call you at 5. Vivian set the phone down. She made herself eat something. Bread, cheese, whatever was in the refrigerator that didn't require thought, and she stood at the counter and ate it and ran the list in her head. The people who had known about the Ashcroft financing, her grandfather's advisors, most of them dead, her father's inner circle, now largely retired or living abroad, her own counsel, who'd been brought in only 6 months ago, the Ashcroft network intermediary, who communicated through relay and whose identity was compartmentalized by design, and Lucien, who had never known, or whom she had believed had never known. She put the bread down. She thought about October, 14 months ago. She thought about the particular week in October when she had told Lucien, in the library of the Moretti estate on a Tuesday evening while he sat at his desk and didn't look up from what he was reading, that she wanted a divorce. She had been calm. She had expected anger. What she'd gotten was silence, and then a dismissal that had felt at the time like contempt. She had not at the time considered that it might have been calculation. She went to the window. The Aston Martin was still at the curb. The street below was mostly quiet. A few pedestrians, a cab idling at the corner. The man who'd been watching from the black car across the street was gone now, which was either because the surveillance had been pulled or because they'd gotten better at hiding it. She thought about Lucien meeting twice with Thomas Vey. She thought about Vey's engagement 7 years ago, the 11 weeks, the Narrow Project. She thought about the fact that the Ashcroft firm account through which she'd paid Vey was the same account structure. Not the same account, but the same structural template, as 2 of the 3 holding entities through which the syndicate financing flowed. If someone had given that to a federal investigator with the right framing, it didn't look like coincidence. It looked like a system. She was not afraid. She registered the thought and confirmed it. Not afraid, not yet, not in the way that made you small, but she was something she hadn't been in a long time. She was off balance. And in the 36 hours before a tribunal that was supposed to expose Lucien Moretti's failures, she was standing in her kitchen at 10 in the evening, understanding that someone had built a second structure underneath her own, designed to collapse at the exact moment she needed to be standing. She went to bed at midnight because she needed to sleep, and she knew it. She lay in the dark and made herself breathe slowly and thought about who had the access and the motive and the patience to run a 14-month operation that used both her preparations and Lucien's corruption as parallel instruments. She was still thinking about it when she fell asleep. Dara called at 4:52 in the morning. Vivian was already awake. Collis is real, Dara said. 12 years in financial crimes, clean record, no known affiliations to organized crime. The investigation is real. Formally opened 14 months ago, designated as a financial structure inquiry, which means it's not a RICO case yet, but it has the architecture to become one. A pause. The leak is also real. 2 documents from the investigation file were transmitted to an external email address 6 days ago. Collis reported it internally yesterday. He's been trying to contain it. The initial disclosure attorney. This is where it gets difficult. Dara's voice had the particular quality of someone delivering something they'd spent the night verifying because they didn't want to be wrong. The attorney of record on the initial disclosure is a man named Philip Gard. He's a corporate compliance specialist, mid-size firm in the financial district. No organized crime clients on record. Clean practice. She paused. Guard has represented one client in a personal matter unrelated to his corporate work 7 years ago, a family estate dispute. The client's name is on the filing as a co-petitioner. Vivian waited. Constance Moretti, Dara said. The room didn't change. The light was the same pale pre-dawn gray through the curtains. The city outside made its usual sounds. Vivian sat on the edge of her bed with the phone against her ear and felt the thing inside her chest that was not quite betrayal because she hadn't trusted Constance. She'd assessed her, worked alongside her read for the last few days, accepted her warning in good faith, but was close enough to it that the distinction felt, for a moment, academic. She filed the disclosure, Vivian said. Her attorney did. Which is the same thing with 1 degree of separation. Dara paused. 14 months ago. The same week you told Lucien you wanted a divorce. Vivian stood up. She walked to the window. The street below was gray and empty in the early morning, the Aston Martin still at the curb, the city not yet fully awake. She thought about the restaurant in the Flatiron district, the low lighting and the 2 cups of coffee and Constance's warning, delivered with the careful precision of a woman concerned for her safety. He has something. Find out who he is. Before the 19th. She'd sent Vivian to find Thomas Vey. She'd handed her a lead that Vivian had spent 2 days running down, a lead that had sent her in exactly the right direction to miss the thing she should have been looking at. The leak from Collis's office, Vivian said. The documents transmitted 6 days ago. Do we know what they contained? Not specifically, but Collis's investigation file would include the initial disclosure documents, the Ashcroft network structures, the holding entity analysis. Dara paused. If those documents reached Lucien 6 days ago, he didn't need Thomas Vey, Vivian said. Vey was theater, something for me to find and spend time on while the real material was already in his hands. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass of the window. He has federal investigation documents connecting the Ashcroft network to the syndicate financing. He's going to walk into that chamber this morning and present them as evidence that I've been under federal investigation. That the Ashcroft financing wasn't family investment. It was a compromised financial structure that federal investigators have been examining for over a year. The silence on Dara's end was the silence of a woman running the implications and arriving at the same place. Can you counter it? Dara said. Not without Collis standing in that chamber, and Collis is not going to walk into a mafia tribunal to protect my reputation. Vivian took her hand off the glass. I need to get to Constance before 9 o'clock. Vivian, she warned me about Vey. That wasn't nothing. She's running 2 operations simultaneously, and I don't think she fully controls which one lands where. She was already moving, but to the closet, pulling clothes. She filed the disclosure because she wanted leverage over Lucien, not over me. She wanted a federal investigation in her back pocket in case he became unmanageable. But Lucien found out about it, probably from the leak in Collis's office. And now he's going to use the investigation documents to destroy my credibility in the chamber before I can establish the context. That's a lot of inference. It's the only configuration that fits all the pieces. She pulled on her jacket. Call Okafor. Tell him Selena needs to move up her timeline. If today goes wrong, I want her clear of the compound before this evening. She paused. And call the Ferrante contact. Tell them I need 10 minutes before the chamber opens. The Ferrantes. Dara's voice was careful. You're going to trade them something. I'm going to tell them the truth about the Ashcroft financing and let them draw their own conclusions about whether they want to sit in a chamber and watch a man use leaked federal documents to run a narrative while the real ledgers are sitting right there. She was at the door now, keys in hand. That's not trading. That's information in the right hands at the right time. There's a difference. Yes, Vivian said. There is. I know what side of it I'm on. She went down in the elevator and out to the car in the cold early morning and drove through the nearly empty streets toward the Moretti compound with the heat running and both hands on the wheel and the particular clarity that came, she had found, when you had been outmaneuvered and had 15 minutes and a moving vehicle in which to decide who you were going to be about it. Constance answered the door herself. 6:45 in the morning, and she was dressed, which told Vivian she hadn't slept either. They stood in the doorway for a moment in the cold November air. Then Constance stepped back and let her in. They went to the sitting room. No tea this time. No performance of civility. "Philip Guard," Vivian said. Constance sat down in the chair by the window. She looked, for the first time in Vivian's memory of her, tired in a way that wasn't physical. "How long did it take you?" "Dara's very good." Vivian remained standing. "You filed a federal disclosure on your own son's financial operations." "I filed it as contingency." Constance's voice was even, but the effort behind it was visible now, the muscles in her jaw doing work. 14 months ago, when you asked for the divorce and I understood what the instability would mean for the syndicate, I needed an instrument. Something that could be used to force accountability if Lucien refused to step back willingly. An internal challenge from the capos could be violent. A council tribunal could be political. But a federal investigation... She paused. A federal investigation is clean, surgically targeted. It was never meant to touch you. But it does. Because of the leak, which I did not arrange. She looked up at Vivian and her eyes were clear and hard and very tired. I don't know who pulled documents from Collis's office. I know that Lucien has them. I know that because he came to me 2 nights ago and told me he was going to use them. He wanted me to know. Her mouth tightened. He wanted me to understand that he knew what I'd done. The room was very quiet. Outside, the November garden was silver with frost. "He's going to walk into that chamber this morning," Vivian said, "and tell the council that his ex-wife is under federal financial investigation and that the capital she funneled into the syndicate for 18 years was part of a compromise structure that federal investigators have been examining. He's going to use documents from a legitimate federal inquiry to construct a fiction, and every Don in that room is going to look at those documents and see official letterhead and believe the worst interpretation before anyone has a chance to provide context." "Yes." "And you handed him the instrument." Constance was quiet. It was the most honest thing Vivian had ever seen her do. "Can you fix it?" Vivian said. "I can't unfile the disclosure." Constance's hands were folded in her lap with a tightness that suggested they wanted to be doing something else. "But I can be in that chamber this morning, and I can tell them what the disclosure actually was, what I actually filed and why, and what Lucien is doing with material that was leaked from a federal investigation, which is itself a federal crime." She met Vivian's eyes. "It won't be comfortable." "No." "I will be testifying against my son in front of the council." "Yes." The silence held for a long moment. Constance Moretti looked at the window and at the frost on the garden, and at something Vivian couldn't see. She looked like a woman doing a calculation that had no clean answer. She looked like a woman who had made every decision in her life from a position of control and was now sitting inside one that had gotten past her. "All right," she said. Vivian nodded. She turned toward the door. "Vivian." Constance's voice stopped her. She turned back. The older woman was still looking at the window. "I'm sorry," she said, "for the disclosure, for not being clear about what I was running and why." She paused. "I treated you as a variable in a calculation about my son. That was wrong." Vivian looked at her. She thought about 18 years in a library on a Tuesday evening and a man who didn't look up from his desk. She thought about a 14-page contract and a young woman with her hands finally steady. She thought about an emerald car and a signature on a line and the particular freedom of a woman who had stopped performing helplessness. "Be in the chamber at 9, she said. "That's what I need from you." She walked out into the November morning and got back in the Aston Martin and drove toward the city and the chamber and the accumulated weight of everything the next 3 hours would. The chamber was on the 4th floor of a building in Lower Manhattan that had no signage and no listing and received its mail at a separate address 6 blocks away. It had been used by the 5 families for 40 years for exactly this kind of proceeding. Not a court, not a meeting, something in between that operated by its own protocols and carried a weight that no formal legal structure could replicate, because the consequences it dispensed were immediate and permanent in ways that courts took years to approximate. Vivian arrived at 8:47. The Ferrante contact, a compact, gray-haired man named Sal Benedetto, who had known her grandfather and carried that history in the way he stood when she walked toward him, was waiting in the corridor outside the main doors as she'd asked. He had two men flanking him at a respectful distance and the expression of a man who had gotten up early and was prepared to be either very pleased or very disappointed, depending on the next 10 minutes. "Ms. Ashcroft." He shook her hand. His grip was brief and firm. "Thank you for coming early." She kept her voice low. The corridor had other people in it, attorneys, capo representatives, the administrative staff of the chamber, all moving with the focused purposefulness of people who understood that today was not a routine day. "I need you to understand something before we go in, about the Ashcroft Network's financing relationship with the Moretti Syndicate. The full structure, not the version Lucien is going to present." Benedetto looked at her with the careful attention of a man whose survival had always depended on knowing the difference between information and manipulation. "Talk," he said. She talked. She gave him 7 minutes, compressed, precise, the full architecture of the 18-year financing arrangement, the holding entities, the quarterly transfers, the reason for the discretion, the documentation that existed to support every claim. She told him about the federal disclosure and who had filed it and why and what had been leaked and how Lucien intended to use it. She told him about Thomas Vey and the misdirection and the 2 private meetings. She told him all of it with the flat clarity of someone who had stopped managing information and was simply releasing it because the time for management had passed. Benedetto listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You're telling me Lucien's been operating on Ashcroft Capital for 18 years without knowing it," he said, "without investigating it. There's a difference." He looked at her steadily. "And you're telling me this now because you want us to hear the ledgers in context." "I'm telling you because it's true, and because you deserve to make your decision with accurate information." She met his gaze. "That's all." He studied her for another moment. Then he nodded, once, the way men in his position nodded when they'd assessed something and reached a conclusion they weren't going to announce. "All right," he said. He turned and said something quietly to one of his men, who moved off down the corridor. Vivian walked to the chamber doors. Dara Fine was already inside, seated in the attorney's gallery to the left of the main floor. She caught Vivian's eye as she came in and gave a small, tight nod that communicated several things simultaneously. She was ready, the documents were organized, and she was not particularly confident about the next hour, but she was prepared for it. The chamber itself was a long room with dark wood paneling and a high ceiling and a central table around which the Dons and their senior representatives sat. There were 7 families represented. The air in the room had the specific density of a space where too many carefully composed people were maintaining their composure at the same time. Lucien was already seated. He had his attorney beside him and 2 of his capos positioned behind him, and he looked, from across the room, exactly like what he'd spent his life constructing. A man who belonged at the center of any room he occupied. He looked, to anyone who didn't know him, entirely composed. Vivian knew him. She could see, in the set of his jaw and the angle of his shoulders, and the way he had not looked up when she came in, that he was running hot underneath the surface, that he had spent the night with federal documents in his hands, and the certainty of a man who believed he'd finally found the thing that would turn the tide, and that certainty had the particular brittle quality of something assembled too quickly. She took her seat in the presenter's gallery across from him. She folded her hands on the table in front of her. She did not look at him. Constance Moretti came in at 3 minutes to 9. She sat in the observer's gallery along the south wall and did not look at her son. Lucien looked at his mother. Something moved across his face. Fast, controlled, gone. The presiding Don, an elderly man named Caruso, who had been managing proceedings like this for 30 years, and had the unhurried manner of someone who understood that the appearance of patience was itself a form of power, called the chamber to order at exactly 9 o'clock. The ledger review took 40 minutes. Reardon Cole presented it without embellishment, standing at the front of the chamber with printed documentation and the composed neutrality of a man who had decided that accuracy was the only position he could live with. He walked through the 14 months of diversions, the amounts, the routing, the personal account. He answered questions from 3 different family representatives with the precision of someone who had anticipated every question and prepared for each one. Lucien's attorney objected twice. Both objections were heard and set aside. When Reardon finished, the room was very quiet. The kind of quiet that follows a demonstration of something everyone in the room had suspected but hadn't seen confirmed in documentary form. Then Lucien's attorney stood up. His name was Hargrove, and he was one of the most expensive defense attorneys in the city, and he moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to turning rooms. He introduced the federal investigation documents with the measured cadence of a man presenting evidence he considered decisive. He laid it out efficiently. The Ashcroft network structures, the holding entities, the 14-month federal inquiry. He placed the documents on the table where the presiding dons could see them, and he said, in the tone of a man drawing an unavoidable conclusion, that the capital which had sustained the Moretti Syndicate for 18 years had come from a financial structure currently under federal examination, that the woman who had managed that structure had a documented relationship with a forensic investigator, and that the ledger review being presented as evidence of misconduct was itself a document shaped by parties with a vested interest in the outcome. He did not say Vivienne had committed crimes. He was too careful for that. He implied a sufficiency of doubt. He implied that the picture was more complicated than it appeared. He implied, with the elegance of a man who'd spent 30 years implying things in rooms where outright accusations required proof, that the chamber should consider who benefited from Lucien Moretti's exposure before they accepted the exposure as impartial. Vivienne listened to all of it. She kept her hands folded on the table. She kept her breathing even. She felt Dara watching her from the attorney's gallery and did not look over. When Hargrove finished, Don Caruso looked at Vivienne. "Ms. Ashcroft, you've requested time to respond." "Yes," she said. She stood up. She spoke for 22 minutes. She did not use notes. She presented the Ashcroft financing structure in full. The same information she'd given Benedetto in the corridor, expanded now for the full chamber, supported by documentation that Dara distributed to each family's representative as she spoke. She walked through every holding entity, every quarterly transfer, every record of legitimacy. She explained the reason for discretion and the history behind it. She named the federal investigation, named the agent, and explained precisely what the investigation was examining and what it was not. And was not, she made clear, examining the legality of the Ashcroft transfers, which were clean, but was examining the broader question of whether the syndicate's financial structure had appropriate separation from the financing network. She explained Thomas Vey, his engagement, its purpose, its timeline, its documentation. She had the original contract in the materials Dara had distributed. She explained how it had been used as misdirection. Then she said, "The federal disclosure that initiated the investigation 14 months ago was filed by an attorney named Philip Gard on behalf of a client. The documentation of that filing is available to the chamber through counsel." She paused. Gard's client was Constance Moretti. The room moved. Not loudly. These were men too disciplined for loud reactions. But it moved. Heads turned. Eyes went to Constance along the south wall. Constance sat with her hands folded in her lap and her chin level and her eyes forward. She did not look at her son. Lucien turned and looked at his mother. His face went through three things in approximately 2 seconds: comprehension, fury, and something that might have been grief. All of them too fast and too controlled to fully register in the room, but entirely visible to Vivienne, who was watching him from 6 feet away with the specific attention of a woman who had spent 18 years learning to read what he kept underneath the surface. "The disclosure was filed as a contingency instrument," Vivienne continued, "not as a criminal referral. It was intended to create legal accountability options in the event of a leadership dispute within the syndicate. The documents that Lucien Moretti is presenting today were obtained through a leak from the federal investigation file, a leak that is itself under internal review and constitutes a federal offense." She looked at the chamber. Lucien Moretti diverted syndicate funds for personal use. That is documented. He also obtained leaked federal documents and used them to construct a narrative designed to obscure his own misconduct by impugning the credibility of the financial infrastructure that kept this organization solvent for 18 years. She paused. "I'm asking the chamber to see both of those things clearly." She sat down. The room was very, very quiet. Lucien stood up before his attorney could stop him. Hargrove put a hand on his arm and Lucian moved the hand aside with the flat deliberateness of a man who had stopped taking counsel. He looked across the chamber at Vivian, and the muscles in his jaw were working, and his eyes had the quality she recognized. The quality of a man who has run out of architecture and is standing in the open. "You did this," he said. Not loud, almost conversational. Worse than if he'd shouted. 18 years, you were running the money. You had everything I needed to build this, and you never told me. You made me." He stopped. "You made me dependent on something I didn't know existed." "You made yourself dependent," Vivian said. Her voice was quiet, even, with no heat in it at all. "I provided capital that was offered in good faith as part of a family arrangement. I told you, the first year of our marriage, that the Ashcroft network had interests that supported the syndicate. You told me you didn't need the details and I should let you manage it." She held his gaze. "I let you manage it. You managed it the way you managed everything, by assuming you understood the whole picture because you understood the part of it you could see." Don Caruso. Hargrove was on his feet. "My client—" "Sit down," Don Caruso said. Not harshly, with the authority of a man who hadn't needed to raise his voice in a decade. Hargrove sat down. Lucien was still standing. He looked at Vivian for another moment, and she looked back at him, and the space between them held the weight of 18 years and a library and a Tuesday and a document signed in charcoal gray and the particular violence of a long marriage ending not in explosion, but in the slow accumulation of moments when one person stopped choosing the other. He sat down. "Ochi." The deliberation took 2 hours. Vivian waited in a side room with Dara and a cup of coffee that went cold and did not speak much. Dara reviewed documents. Vivian sat in a chair near the window and looked at the street below and thought about nothing with the focused intention of a woman who understood that thinking was not what the next 2 hours required. At 12:30, Don Caruso's assistant came for them. The chamber had reached its findings. Lucien Moretti's authority as Don of the Moretti Syndicate was suspended pending a full review of the financial diversions and a formal vote of the family capos. His access to syndicate accounts and operational decision-making was frozen immediately. The federal investigation documents were to be surrendered to a neutral family attorney for review, and the leak was to be formally reported to federal counsel, not out of cooperation with the government, but out of the principle that a man who obtained those documents through illegal means had no standing to use them in a proceeding claiming to be about integrity. Constance Moretti's role as family matriarch was noted and not formally sanctioned, with the acknowledgement that her disclosure had been filed in the syndicate's interest and that the use made of it by her son was not her responsibility. This was delivered in the careful language of men who understood how to hold two true things simultaneously when the alternative was a confrontation no one wanted. The Ashcroft financing was formally acknowledged as legitimate, historically beneficial to the syndicate, and a matter of record. No further action regarding the Ashcroft network was indicated. Vivian listened to all of it with her hands in her lap and her face composed and felt, when it was done, not triumph, but the specific exhaustion of a long thing finally closing. Selena was already gone from the compound by the time the findings were delivered. Okafor had moved her timeline up as instructed. She'd left that morning with 2 bags and a folder of documents he'd prepared and the keys to an apartment in a building across the river that existed in no Moretti ledger, paid through a trust structured in her daughter's name. She'd left a note on the kitchen counter of the guest suite. It was addressed to Constance, and it said only, "I'm not doing this to hurt you. I'm doing it so she doesn't grow up afraid." Constance found it at 4 in the afternoon when she returned from the chamber. She read it standing at the counter. She folded it and put it in her pocket and stood in the kitchen of the Georgian house that had been the center of everything she'd built and managed and sustained and lost pieces of across decades, and she felt the full weight of the afternoon settle into her bones. She did not cry. She put the kettle on. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table in the quiet house and drank it slowly. Marco Testa found Lucien in the library at the compound at 6 in the evening. He was sitting at his desk, the same chair, the same room where Vivian had told him she wanted a divorce, and he hadn't looked up. He was not looking at anything now. He was sitting with his hands flat on the desk and his jacket off, and his tie loosened and the look of a man who has spent a long day being reduced to something smaller than he'd expected to become. Marco came in and closed the door and sat in the chair across the desk. They'd sat like this hundreds of times. It felt, tonight, like the last time. "The capos are meeting tomorrow," Marco said. "I know. Most of them are going to vote for the suspension." "I know, Marco." A silence. The library had the particular quality of a room where a great many serious things had been said, and the walls had absorbed all of them. "What do you want to do?" Marco said. Lucian looked at his hands. He was quiet for a long moment. "What do you think I should do?" Marco had not been asked that question in 20 years. He considered it with the seriousness it deserved. "Step back," he said. "Voluntarily, before the vote. It changes the shape of it. You walk away on your own terms instead of getting removed." He paused. "It doesn't fix the diversion, but it gives the organization a cleaner transition, and it—" He stopped. "It's the right thing." Lucien was quiet. Marco watched him and thought about 20 years and the things he'd witnessed and done and chosen to be present for, and the things he wasn't sure he could have done differently, and the things he knew he could have. He thought about Riordan, standing in that chamber and presenting the ledgers cleanly, and sleeping, probably, without trouble tonight because of it. "Yeah," Lucien said, finally. The word came out flat and tired and carrying something beneath it that might have been, in a different man in a different room, the beginning of something honest. "Okay, well, The formal resignation of Lucien Moretti as Don of the Moretti Syndicate was submitted the following morning through Family Council. It was structured as a voluntary withdrawal pending a transition review. The language was careful. The outcome was final. The syndicate passed to an internal council of 3 senior capos, with Marco Testa as the coordinating figure, pending a formal succession process that would take months and would, by all early indicators, result in a leadership more focused on organizational continuity than individual power. They were not good men in any complete sense, but they were men who understood that what had nearly destroyed the organization was not exposure, but the specific arrogance of a person who had come to believe the rules existed for everyone else. 3 weeks after the tribunal, Vivian met with Agent Collis in a federal office on the west side of Manhattan. Dara sat beside her. The meeting lasted 2 hours and ended with a formal acknowledgement that the Ashcroft Network's historical financing relationship with the Moretti Syndicate would be reviewed but not prosecuted, provided that the network's restructuring, Tercham, already underway, proceeded with full transparency to counsel. Collis walked them to the elevator afterward. In the hallway, before the doors opened, he said, "For what it's worth, you didn't have to come in voluntarily." "I know," Vivian said. "That's why I did." The elevator arrived. She got in. The organization Vivian began building that winter had no formal name. It operated through 3 entities: a legal practice, a financial services firm, and a housing trust, all legitimate, all above board, all funded by the Ashcroft Family Network's restructured capital. Its function was specific, and its clients were women. Women inside powerful organized crime families who needed legal protection, financial independence, relocation support, or simply someone to call who would answer without judgment. Dara Fine ran the legal arm. Okafor sat on the advisory board. The housing trust worked with 8 cities in its first year. The financial services firm helped 11 women establish independent accounts that their husbands or partners did not know about, which was legal, and which, for each of those 11 women, was the first autonomous financial act of their adult lives. It was not rescue. Vivian was clear about that, to herself and to everyone who worked with her. It was options. It was the extension of a real choice to women who had been living in the absence of one. What they did with that choice was theirs. All of it. She drove the Aston Martin to a charity event the following spring, the first public event associated with the trust. She parked it at the curb in front of the venue and got out and stood for a moment in the April evening and felt the car at her back and the light on the street and the specific lightness of a woman who is not performing anything for anyone. Lucien came to the event. She hadn't invited him and hadn't not invited him. The event was publicly announced, and he was, in some circles, still connected enough to hear about such things. He arrived late, as he always had, though there was nothing theatrical about it now. He was not a Don anymore. He was a man in a gray suit who had spent the winter doing something she didn't know about and had aged, she thought, more in 4 months than in the previous 10 years. He found her near the edge of the room, away from the main gathering. She saw him coming and did not move toward him or away. He stopped about 3 feet away, which was a careful distance, and looked at her with an expression that had none of the architecture she was used to seeing on his face. No performance, no calculation. Just a man standing in the accurate light of what he'd done and who he'd become. "You look well," he said. "Lucien, I know." He was quiet for a moment. "I know I don't get to, He stopped, tried again. "What you built here. What you're doing." He looked around the room, the attorneys, the women from the trust, the particular quality of a gathering where something real was the purpose. "It's not what I would have expected from you." "What would you have expected?" He thought about it. Actually thought about it, which she noted. "Something harder," he said. "Something that looked more like what I would have done." "I know," she said. "That's why you didn't understand what you had." He absorbed that. He didn't flinch from it, which was something. "I'm sorry," he said. I know it doesn't fix anything. I'm not asking it to. I just need to say it once, clearly, without asking for anything in return." He met her eyes. "I'm sorry for what I did to you, for how long I let her go on." She looked at him. She had thought about this moment in the abstract, not often, but occasionally, in the months since the tribunal, and in the abstract she had not known what she would feel. Now, standing in the actual fact of it, she felt something that was not forgiveness and not indifference, but something quieter than both. A settling. The specific quality of a wound that has been cleaned and covered and has closed, not without scar, but closed. "I hear you," she said. Not forgiven, not forgotten. Heard. She had learned that those were different things, and that the difference mattered enormously, especially to herself. He nodded. He looked for a moment like he might say something else. Then he didn't. He turned and walked back toward the main gathering, and she watched him go and felt the room continue around her, so conversation, the clink of glasses, the sound of women talking to each other with the ease of people who are in a place that was built to hold them, and she felt underneath all of it the quiet. On a Thursday in May, 10 days after the gala, Vivian drove the Aston Martin south along the coastal highway in the early morning before the traffic came. The windows were down despite the chill. The water was visible on her left, gray-green in the early light, moving with its own momentum. She drove without music, which she rarely did, because she wanted to hear the engine and the road and the particular sound of open air. She had a meeting in the city at noon. 3 new clients, referred through Okafor, women whose situations were different from each other and every specific and identical in the one that mattered. She had reviewed their files the night before. She would sit with each of them in a room that was not a courtroom and not a chamber, but something more patient than either, and she would tell them what she'd told the others. You have options, real ones. What you do with them is yours. She drove for an hour without stopping. The light changed as the sun came up behind her, moving from gray to pale gold across the water, and the Aston Martin's hood caught it and threw it back in that deep, shifting green that her grandfather had called the color of everything worth keeping. She had loved him, her grandfather. He'd been a difficult man, precise, demanding, with a way of seeing the world that left room for loyalty, but not much for softness. He'd built something complicated and passed it to people who tried to maintain it with varying degrees of integrity. He had believed in the Ashcroft name the way some people believe in permanent things, as a matter of identity rather than argument. She thought about what he would have made of the trust, the legal arm, the housing network. She thought he probably would have found it impractical. She thought he also would have funded it without being asked. She pulled off the highway onto a bluff overlook that she'd discovered the previous fall. Gravel, a low wooden railing, nothing remarkable except the view. She got out and stood at the railing with the wind coming off the water and her hair moving and both hands on the worn wood. Below, the ocean was doing what the ocean always did. Indifferent, enormous, continuing. She stood there for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, not making plans, not measuring what had been gained against what had been lost, which was a calculation she had decided sometime in the winter she was done performing. Both things were true. She had lost years, and she had found herself inside the losing of them. And that was not a clean equation, and it was not one she needed to resolve. She had signed her name on a line and walked out of a courthouse and gotten in a car and driven away. Everything after that had been hers. She pushed off the railing, walked back to the car, got in. The leather seat held the warmth of the early sun. She put her hands on the wheel and felt the familiar grip of it, the weight of something well-made and old and still running, and pulled back onto the coastal highway heading north. The city was an hour away. She had work to do. She drove.